Hello, everyone. I'm Bonnie Glaser, Director of the Asia Program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and welcome to our event on China's Russia strategy, the Ukraine crisis, and beyond. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has had the greatest impact on the people of Ukraine. Estimated civilian casualties in Ukraine, which are very, very difficult to know accurately, now number over 2,000 people. Over 3 million refugees have fled the country. For international relations experts, the war marks an intensification of great power conflict. And today, we're going to focus on China's role and interests in the war in Ukraine. Beijing has notably avoided criticizing Russia and refrained from using the term invasion. And of course, 3 weeks before the war began, Chinese leader Xi Jinping met with Russia's President Vladimir Putin and signed a remarkable 5,300 words joint statement celebrating their no limits partnership. And as the United States, along with its allies and partners around the world, have imposed sanctions on Russia, China has said that it will continue to conduct normal trade and financial transactions. The Biden administration has warned Beijing that if it provides assistance to the Russian economy or to its military, China will become the target of secondary sanctions. So what is China's likely course of action, and what outcome of the conflict best serves Chinese interests? Why are the Chinese leaning toward Moscow so heavily? And what does China's response to the conflict tell us about how Chinese foreign policy is likely to evolve in the future under Xi Jinping in his third term in office, which he is slated to get this fall at the 20th Party Congress? So we are really just thrilled to have three world-renowned experts to discuss these issues. We'd like to welcome the three of them now. Akio Takahara is professor of contemporary Chinese politics at the Graduate School of Law and Politics at the University of Tokyo. Evan Medeiros is the Penner Family Chair in Asia Studies in the School of Foreign Service and the Kling Family Distinguished Fellow in U.S.-China Studies at Georgetown University in Washington. And then our third panelist is Mathieu Duchâtel, who is director of the Asia program at Institut Montaigne in Paris. So we hope to bring all of you who have joined us today into the conversation, and you can submit your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So we're going to jump right in. I'll start with you, Evan. Let's sort of set the table, explain to everybody from your perspective what Beijing's position is on the war in Ukraine and how it has evolved.
Well, good morning, Bonnie, and thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you and with Mathieu and Akio, two old friends and colleagues. I've been looking forward to this panel all week. So I've spent most of my career, as have you, Bonnie, studying Chinese foreign policy. And I think that the events in Ukraine, the Chinese response to Ukraine, may become the sort of iconic example of Chinese foreign policy in the new era, to use a Xi Jinping term. Because China's position on Ukraine is unique, it's important, it's worrisome, and it is very rapidly evolving in real time. And it's evolving, I think, in very dangerous directions, dangerous for the stability of the US-China relationship, dangerous in terms of whether or not it contributes to the resolution of the awful war in Ukraine, and really goes to broader questions about the global distribution of power. If China faces some very significant choices right now in its foreign policy, and depending on how it chooses, global politics may be changed for decades. So let me explain what I mean. China's response from the beginning has been interesting to me, first and foremost, because the Chinese are running a different playbook, or they're using a different play in their playbook from the 2014 annexation of Crimea, right? Back then, it was very careful, very studied neutrality, and a very hands-off approach. This time around, the Chinese have been much more actively involved. They openly express sympathy and support for Russian actions. They focus on blaming the United States and NATO, and China watchers in the audience may remember a few pretty unique press conferences in which the foreign ministry spokesperson Hua Chunying was referencing all sorts of historical or points in Chinese history in which China itself was, invaded by Western powers. The Chinese, of course, avoid any responsibility. They deny the contradictions in their position, specifically the fact that they continue to call for protection of sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, which to date had been a very strong partner of China in Europe. And they also call for diplomacy. And then that position has since evolved and evolved in some interesting ways. Xi Jinping early on in the crisis reached out to the leaders of Germany and France, but Xi Jinping didn't really offer anything. It's clear to me that Xi Jinping was simply trying to manage their expectations. And that strategy seemed to be working when High Commissioner Borrell even publicly stated that perhaps China should be a mediator in the conflict. Now, the Chinese never rose to the occasion. That's probably a good thing. But in the last week, China appears to have crossed or is coming close to crossing some very critical thresholds. There appears to be a joint Russia-China disinformation campaign spreading these rumors that the US operated biological weapons facilities. There have been a lot of rumors and some very interesting research about whether or not coordinated disinformation was going on. I think this is probably the best example that, in fact, there is a coordinated disinformation campaign. And then perhaps most recently, reports in the US media that US intelligence have evidence that the Russians have asked the Chinese for military equipment, lethal and non-lethal, and the Chinese have responded positively. Now, nothing has been transferred yet. And my guess is that this was the centerpiece of the conversation between Jake Sullivan and Yang Jiechi in Rome on Monday, basically laying out the costs and the consequences geopolitically and economically if the Chinese cross this particular threshold. And so I think we sit at an exceptionally delicate moment in the US-China relationship. I can see at least sort of two basic fundamental futures. Are we going to settle into a future of long-term amity and hostility where Russia and China are not only aligned along the lines of the joint statement that you referenced, but they're actively coordinating with each other to tear down Western rules, norms, and institutions, and providing military assistance to Russia for its aggression in Ukraine, I think would close the book on that. Or is there another future that effectively is one of competitive coexistence, where both sides try to find or establish a new stable equilibrium in the relationship, but a relationship that's fundamentally defined by security competition as well as economic interdependence. So the Chinese position has evolved. I believe we're in an exceptionally unique and delicate time. I can't think of another time in the relationship, perhaps 1989, where so much is on the table and so much is at stake. Over to you, Bonnie.
Great, Evan. As you know, this morning, there has been an announcement that President Biden will speak to Xi Jinping tomorrow. So I will come back to you and ask you about that. But let me turn now to Akio and ask you about, Xi Jinping, of course, his relationship with Putin is an important driver of this relationship. And so tell us about the role of Russia in Xi Jinping's worldview and how you think that has shaped China's approach to the conflict in Ukraine.
Well, first of all, hello, Bonnie. Thank you very much for your invitation to this very important conversation. I would say there is a sort of a Russification of Chinese worldview. You know, the Russians are obsessed with this competition with the United States. And increasingly, I find the Chinese also obsessed with this strategic competition that they have with the US. So it's the world view that they see through the lens, through the filter of their relations with the United States. And that gives, of course, a very distorted vision of the world. And so from Xi Jinping's point of view, Russia is the most important partner in competing with the United States. So therefore, they cannot accuse Russia. And I wonder if any one of you have noticed a very interesting difference in the way the conversation between Xi Jinping and Putin that was conducted on the 25th of February, one day after the invasion, the start of the invasion, reported by Xinhua and the Russian embassy in Beijing. According to the Xinhua version, Xi Jinping in this conversation on the 25th of February told Putin that he supports the solution of this issue between Russia and Ukraine through conversation. That's what Xinhua told us. But according to the Russian embassy in Beijing, that's not, well, a different line is introduced. In that report, according to the Russians, Xi Jinping emphasized that he respected the actions adopted by the Russian leadership to deal with the crisis at hand. So virtually he endorsed the decision by Putin to make an all-out attack on Ukraine. Perhaps at that point of time, he believed Putin and thought that the war would end very soon. And that's why he dared to say those things. But because of these remarks, perhaps the Chinese cannot call the act an invasion, and they cannot move from where they are at the moment, because they are in this very deep contradiction that they say the principles of sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity is very important, but on the other hand, they cannot criticize the Russians. So this is the situation in which the Chinese find themselves. They are at a crossroads, as it were, or in a catch-22 kind of a situation. And that's based on the worldview of Xi Jinping, which is getting closer and closer to the Russian worldview. That's my understanding.
Thank you, Akio. So Mathieu, let me ask you what you think China is going to do regarding the sanctions that so many countries around the world have now imposed on Russia. The United States has said clearly that if China violates the sanctions, that we will implement secondary sanctions. I wonder if you could tell us whether you think the European Union is fully aboard on that potential outcome. Putting sanctions on Russia is one thing. I imagine that imposing a secondary sanction is viewed a little bit differently from Europe. So first, do you think China will comply with the sanctions? And secondly, if you don't, what do you think will be the reaction from Europe?
Thank you, Bonnie, and good morning. Hello to my two co-panelists, and thank you very much for having me. I like the term that's even used, crossing a threshold. I see it as crossing a threshold from what we have currently, which is a Chinese policy of tacit endorsement of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, to a next level that could be providing active support to the Russian war. And I think observing China's response to the Western sanctions, to the sanctions imposed on Russia by G7 countries and the EU, is a very good vantage point to see where China is currently. China has not made use of its anti-foreign sanctions law. It may in the future. That would be crossing a threshold. That would be moving from tacit endorsement to active support. And from what we can currently see, and of course it's a bit early to tell, we have a pattern of compliance when costs are an issue. And there are indeed reports that Chinese companies are complying with sanctions, for example, and not providing aviation parts to the Russian civil aviation. There are also reports of financial transactions in US dollars not being conducted by Chinese banks. But when you have studied China's approach to foreign sanctions in other crises or wars, you know that there is always a pattern of exploiting loopholes and the pattern of evasion. That has been the case with many crisis and sanctions regime. So I'd say two things here, which I think are the most important. The first one on Russian energy exports. I think it's very important to keep in mind that whatever China does, if the European decision to reduce consumption of Russian gas by 100 billion cubic meters by 2023 is implemented correctly, meaning a decrease of 50% of Russian gas revenues, Chinese increased imports will not make up for the difference. In other words, I don't think that China can provide a lifeline to the Russian economy when it comes to gas exports. And that's because whatever happens, the China-Russia energy relationship is on a trajectory that is already set. And I think the only factor or variable that could change is the price that China may get from Russia as it negotiates the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline. That's the first thing, no lifeline on gas. The other thing is on export control. And here it's fascinating to see how fast the US, the EU, other G7 economies have been able to come together to create a very strict sanctions regime that aims at degrading the ability of the Russian military complex. There's been unprecedented coordination and extremely fast adoption of measures that go beyond everything that had been done in the past. The export control measures that have been adopted go beyond the usual list of dual-use products. It's basically, everything that can have a positive impact on the Russian arms industry. For example, legacy semiconductors is one example of item that is not on dual-use list and that is currently imposed as a sanction against Russia. And I think that here there is some space for China to provide some support to the Russian arms industry for one particular reason, because a lot of Chinese entities are actually also the target of restrictive measures that have been imposed by the US, being, for example, on the entity list. And I would put a question mark here on the possible compliance or on the readiness to comply by Chinese entities that are also targeted by restrictive measures. Of course, this could be an incentive for them to increase cooperation with the Russian arms industry.
Thank you, Mathieu. So we have one question, which is really one that's already on my list about what role China could play in bringing an end potentially to this conflict. So my own view is that China wants an outcome in this conflict that does not strengthen the United States and the West, and that it would not like to see a very much weakened Russia. but I'm open to alternative views. So I'll turn to you, Evan, and ask you, and then if either Mathieu or Akio, you have different views, please feel free to jump in. Can China play the role of mediator? Will it try to shape an outcome to this conflict that is favorable to Chinese interests?
Thanks, Bonnie. This is an important question, and it's one that has been on the table for the last few days. I mean, certainly the Chinese can play the role as mediator. They have this experience with the six-party talks, but I don't think the issue really is can they do it. The question is, should they do it, right? Is it in the interests of the United States and our allies and partners in Europe? And I think the response from me is unquestionably no, it's not in our interest to do that. China's behavior to date is, as we've discussed, is at best, it's pro-Russian neutrality, right? It's sort of rhetorical neutrality, but with a clear lean toward Russia. And as Mathieu very nicely put it, even that is moving from passivity to active support for Russia. So, in that instance, I don't see why it would be in the interests of Ukraine or NATO to invite China to be the mediator. I don't think it's in our interest to do so. But as we all try to understand precisely what is motivating China, in particular, this shift from sort of passive complicity and enabling to much more active complicity and enabling of Russia, there is this hypothesis out there, and Akio was very articulate, that when the Chinese look at Ukraine, their view is, well, you have two declining powers from a Chinese perspective, Russia and the United States. Let them fight it out. Let them be distracted. Let them use their resources. And we, China, will just sort of stay over here in Asia, continue to build up our domestic capabilities and emerge from this as a global leader. So it's not clear to me that the Chinese are interested in doing so. In the last week, European officials and others have put on the table the possibility of China mediating. And the Chinese haven't really jumped at that. Wang Yi has actually been very, very careful in distancing himself and not grabbing that particular opportunity. But I would say if there are some European officials or Ukrainians that want to test this proposition, I think they should, before they invite China to be a mediator, I think they should ask a few sort of gating questions first, like, okay, China, publicly, will you call for, will you make much more serious efforts to aid the humanitarian crisis, contribute more than you've contributed to date, which they haven't done. Their humanitarian aid has been very modest. Number two, China, will you at least call out Russia for its strikes on civilian targets, right? Just criticize, criticize Russia for what looks like indiscriminate striking of civilian targets. If the Chinese aren't able to meet those two tests, why would you ever want them to be a mediator, right? Because the idea behind a mediator is somebody that can be even-handed. Final point is the experience of the six-party talks. It suggests that the Chinese may not be the most even-handed, or will not be even-handed facilitators of the of a negotiated solution, right? This in the six-party talks, my impression is their view was essentially that they were the defense attorney for North Korea for the reasons that this panel will know well, that they still wanted North Korea as a buffer state. They worried about collapse of North Korea causing chaos in Northeast Asia on their northeastern border, et cetera, et cetera. So, I think that this idea of China being a mediator, while it's a hot topic right now, I think it's probably going to fade. And I think that that's right. It should fade from the scene. Over to you, Bonnie.
Do either Akio, Mathieu, do you have any alternate views, or would you like to jump in? Okay, Akio, go ahead.
I think what's most important at this point of time is to stop the carnage. And if there's somebody, whoever, can try and persuade Putin to stop, I think we should let them try. But my impression is it's going to be very difficult for China, even for China, to stop Putin at this moment. I think the Chinese were rather surprised to find the determination of Putin to make this all-out attack on the Ukraine. I don't think the Chinese expected that, because the thinking of the Chinese is based on very rational, realistic thinking. And what Putin is doing now is beyond that. It's based on more emotional resentment or romanticism of pan-Russianism or whatever. And at this point of time, I think it's very difficult for anybody to change Putin's mind as of today.
So Mathieu, let me turn to you and ask what you think are the most important considerations for Xi Jinping in his approach to this conflict going forward. There's a question about whether the trends that in the Chinese economy, for example, is that going to be decisive in how Xi Jinping approaches this conflict? Another question about Taiwan and whether that is really at the top of Xi Jinping's list as he thinks about how to approach this conflict. What are the dominant issues for Xi Jinping?
Thanks, Bonnie. May I also say a word about mediation? I think it's important from a European perspective because this is the stated goal of the External Action Service of the European Union, to push China to play a mediating role in the Ukraine war. This has been stated by Borrell, the High Representative for Foreign Policy of the European Union. And we will have a very quick answer, given that on the 1st of April, there is an EU-China summit. And clearly the question of China's support for Russia is overshadowing the other bilateral issues from a European perspective. I am, like my co-panelists, quite skeptical that China can play such a role, but I would think that two realistic objectives for European diplomacy towards China, even though very difficult and quite ambitious, would be to get a Chinese condemnation of the use of force against civilians in Ukraine, given that China has condemned the use of force against civilians in other wars very strongly. And I think that's an argument to try and get China to take a stance. And the other objective that I would put for the Europeans diplomatically, it's only words, but they matter, would be to get a mention of Chinese support for the legitimate security interest of Ukraine as well, because there is a clear asymmetry in the way China's narrative has been developed and the support for Russian so-called legitimate security interest. Do you want me to also say a few words about the question you asked? I don't want to say too much.
Yes, please.
Right.
Xi Jinping's
Okay.
considerations, and particularly the economy and Taiwan, are those important?
Yes, I think that my reading of the Chinese narrative and the information space in China leads me to think that Taiwan is the key consideration in the eyes of Beijing. The strong convergence of narratives in the way China has been describing the Taiwan issue and Putin has been describing the Ukraine issue from a Russian perspective. Not only, the security dimension, the expansion of NATO from a Russian perspective, the US-Taiwan defense relationship from the perspective of Beijing, but also the notion of national identity, which has been mentioned by Akio Takahara, the Russian nation or the Russian identity of Ukraine, which is very much present in Putin's description or his famous article regarding the unity of the Russian and Ukrainian nations. And also, very strikingly, the link that China and Russia make between the democratic trajectory of Ukrainian society and Taiwanese society and the penetration of liberal values through foreign influence. So I think one of the reasons why the Chinese narrative is so strongly in favor of Russia is because it maintains that the coherence of the Chinese narrative regarding Taiwan. Of course, the lessons, the short-term lessons, I think the long-term lessons will be different. And everything I say, depends very much on the political outcome of the war, clearly, just as a caveat. But the operational lessons for China currently are not very positive in terms of what were the stated Chinese operation goals vis-a-vis Taiwan. So I think that, reducing the Chinese options vis-a-vis Taiwan is clearly something that Beijing wants to avoid. And that would be the consideration number one, in my opinion.
Akio, let me ask you to talk briefly about Japan's interests in this war in Ukraine and whether you think that this has really increased concerns in Tokyo about the possibility of a Chinese attack on Taiwan. Does it carry lessons for such a contingency? We know that there has been a growing concern in Japan about China, about its assertiveness in the East China Sea around the Senkakus, but also more broadly. So how is this conflict in Ukraine viewed in Tokyo in terms of its implications for Japan's security?
Well, we are deeply disturbed by the further undermining of the rules-based order. That's a very basic point. And also, Taiwan certainly is always on our mind, but through this incident, of course, we sort of are redoing our thinking about Taiwan. But judging from the Chinese realistic point of view, we don't think that the war in Ukraine immediately means an increase in the possibility of mainland China making a physical attack on Taiwan. Rather, I think that the Chinese are observing very carefully many things about this war in the Ukraine at the moment. For example, the way of fighting, what sort of weapons are useful and effective? Why are the Russians not successful? What's working for the Ukrainian army? All these military aspect of the war is certainly of close concern and observation by the Chinese side, but also the economic impact of it. The sanctions that are being imposed on Russia or will be imposed, how will that affect the Russian economy and how that will impact on the well-being of the Putin administration? All these things, I think they are observing and analyzing very closely, and in the light of a possible conflict with Taiwan. But at the moment, I think the major means that the major Taiwan policy is not the use of force, but rather non-military means of infiltration and the Sun Tzu art of war, winning without actual fighting. So that's going to continue. But at the same time, all these observations and the studying is done by the Chinese side of the Ukraine war.
Evan, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I do want to jump in. First, on Mathieu's very thoughtful and articulate comments. One issue that I struggle with is to understand the European perspective on this, Mathieu. And what I mean is sort of what is the game plan for China as a mediator, right? What is sort of, what is the EU's belief about how things would play out if China was invited as a mediator, right? I mean, I think all of us are pretty clear-eyed about China's motivations, its positioning. You talked about them moving from passive to active enabling. I thought that's a useful framework. So why do you think EU officials think it would be a good idea for China to mediate when they're not even willing to publicly acknowledge Ukraine's legitimate security interests, right? So I'm curious if you could help me understand that, because as I said in my opening, I see the Ukraine crisis as a wake-up call of sorts. And to go back to one of Akio's very important opening points, I think the Chinese do look at the Ukraine crisis through the lens of US-China competition. And so to pick up this thread about Taiwan, I mean, look, as China watchers, we know Taiwan is always there, right? It's number 1, 2, and 3 priority. But I'm not sure I would necessarily agree with Mathieu that Taiwan is the frame for China's position toward Russia. Alignment with Russia, I don't think really gets China very much on the Taiwan question. The Taiwan issue was not very, the Russian position on it in the February 4th joint statement was really standard language. Militarily, I don't think the Chinese need Russia if China were to choose a military solution on Taiwan. And as Akio said, at least from, I would say, sort of from an outside perspective, the war in Ukraine has simply made the barriers to Chinese political coercion or Chinese coercion and aggression on Taiwan militarily, diplomatically, and economically more difficult, right? All the Ukraine war has done is raise all the barriers. I mean, to make an obvious point, the world has crossed so many extraordinary thresholds in the identification and application of sanctions on Russia, right? I mean, think about it. A month ago, we were debating about whether or not Germany was going to cancel or suspend Nord Stream 2, right? As of today, Nord Stream 2 is like number 10 on the list, right? We have now gone after Russia's central bank reserves. So in terms of sanctions, and again, these are global sanctions, right? These are not just American sanctions, but even more broadly, you now have 400 companies and growing international companies that have, due to changes in international sentiment, have in many cases voluntarily agreed to substantially reduce and in many cases shut down their business operations in Russia. So if you're China and you're looking at this, suddenly your ability to use some mix of coercion and aggression to pull off a quick operation in Taiwan looks much, much more difficult. So, I very much agree with Akio. I don't know if the Chinese would share that particular assessment, and perhaps they are looking at this in a very crude balance of power type of, framework in which they just want the US, Europe, and Russia to sort of fight this out while they stay on the sidelines and continue to accumulate capabilities. Perhaps that's it, but I'd welcome any reactions you might have to those comments.
Okay, we'll give Mathieu a chance to respond, and then Evan, I'm going to come back to you and ask you some tough questions about US policy, since you asked Mathieu some tough questions about Europe. Go ahead.
Yes, these are indeed tough questions, but crucial ones. I do think that there is a frame of mind in Europe that is that all diplomatic channels and all options need to be tried and exhausted. You can see this in the fact, for example, that the French president is continuing regular discussions with President Putin. The French and the German have tried everything they could diplomatically in coordination with the Ukrainian president, but also with allies to maintain open diplomatic channels. And I would tend to think that the External Action Service view on a Chinese mediation is based on, just an exhaustion of other possibilities. Just try. There is an EU-China summit. There is an ongoing conversation between France, Germany, and Xi Jinping, where Ukraine was mentioned. There was a call last week. It's just about trying, but it's also, I think, based on the assumption, which may be a misperception, that the fact that China was clearly not fully informed of Russian war plans may open some space for a conversation, for a constructive conversation. It may be also based on, and only time will tell if this is a misperception or not, that the strong European reaction when it comes to sanctions is slightly changing the dynamic in EU-China relations. And on this, I observe a complete paradox from between what I hear from Chinese, or what I read from Chinese experts and analysts, and what I read and hear from Europeans here. You hear a lot from Chinese sources that they see a weakened Europe as a result of the war in Ukraine. And as they put it, they point out to the end of European strategic autonomy and the strengthening of the transatlantic relationship. That's an analytical framework they maintain for this, the greater reliance on the US. And they see very simply the cost of confrontation with Russia for the Europeans. But in Europe, there's a mood which I would describe as potentially, delusive, that we are emerging much stronger, much more geopolitical from this reaction to the Russian invasion after having made full use of economic sanctions, getting our act together very quickly, coordinating with the G7, the German complete change of approach towards military power, the 2% GDP target suddenly that had been discussed for so many years being adopted. This kind of is background for this attempt. And again, I want to point out that I'm very skeptical that this will work, but maybe some limited objectives could be reached below the level of mediation.
Well,
Let's turn.
I hope Europeans are, should be careful what they wish for.
All right, Evan.
Pulling China into Europe, I think, is going to be a real challenge.
Okay, Evan, my event. We're going to ask you about the U.S. policy here. When you were in the White House, you often talked about the ways to shape China's choices. Of course, many people question whether it is still possible to do that. And I'd like to ask you, as we look toward the phone call tomorrow between President Biden and Xi Jinping, whether you think something could come out of that phone call. What are your recommendations at this point, if we can shape China's choices for doing so? And maybe as part of that, you can just give us a very brief critique of how the Biden administration has handled this, their strategy toward China in this crisis. What are they doing? Are they doing it well? Is it having an impact?
Good, hard questions, Bonnie. So first, I think it's important to remember that, the US-China relationship has obviously become a lot more complex. There's a greater degree of mistrust, sense of competition on both sides. And I think that this current crisis has only highlighted that, and it's complicated domestic politics as well. So I think that the Biden approach has been basically to try and deter greater Chinese involvement as this situation has evolved. And I think that the centerpiece of their diplomacy has been this meeting between Jake Sullivan and Yang Jiechi, and the fact that Biden and Xi, that we learned this morning, are going to get on the phone tomorrow, I think is important. And what that tells me is that we are at an exceptionally delicate moment. And I think that the message to the Chinese right now is basically there are a variety of futures for the relationship, some very dark, some more moderate. And I think that Jake Sullivan probably laid that out, centered around this whole active enabling and cooperation between China and Russia, in particular, a possible Chinese decision to provide lethal and non-lethal military equipment. And so I think that we're at a very delicate moment in the US-China relationship, as I said at the opening. I think China faces a whole variety of choices. My guess is that Russia policy is held in a very, very sort of tight compartment at the very top of the CCP. I think the Putin-Xi relationship is central to this, and there's probably a very small group of advisors around Xi Jinping that are implementing this. I think many of these advisors look at the Russia-China relationship through the lens of competition with the United States. And as a result, I think that what the US is trying to do is trying to highlight, get through to Xi Jinping and the top leaders and highlight to them the thresholds that they're about to cross. And that not only, not only are the costs very, very high from crossing those thresholds, providing military assistance, joint disinformation campaigns, but those thresholds are probably, once you cross them, you can't go back. They're sort of, unrecoverable, and would really put the US-China relationship on a fundamentally different trajectory. So I think that's where we are. I think those are the messages that are being communicated. And the question is, can the Chinese really hear those messages, right? And can the system digest them in a way that allows them to recalibrate? And as you know, Bonnie, 2022 is a very sensitive year in China because of the leadership transition. So moving off of or altering the course of China's relationship with Russia, is probably a political liability for Xi Jinping during such a sensitive year. And so I think it makes it even more difficult because Xi Jinping faces potentially a very challenging choice. Either he's saying, okay, I was wrong and I need to recalibrate and pull back from Russia, or he pulls back and recalibrates, and then he's open to criticism, from his, from other elements within the party during the leadership transition. So it's either that, or he doesn't shift position, and he ends up taking China down a very different pathway in which Russia and China are aligned, and you begin to have Russia and China as a bloc begin to be configured against the US, NATO, allies and partners in East Asia, and you begin to have a reordering moment in global politics. So as I said, I think this is a very, very delicate time, and what the US is trying to do is sort of lay out to China the futures, the costs and the risks of the choices before the Chinese leadership.
Akio, I'd like to get your reactions to that, and whether you think it is possible in any way to drive a wedge between China and Russia. We have one question about whether we need a Henry Kissinger type moment. As you know, we have had debates in the United States over the last year as to whether we should try a reverse Kissinger, which is no longer, I think, on the table. But some people do think that we should try to wean China away from Russia. So Japan has always had important interests in its relationship with Russia. So I'm wondering how you think that the US, Japan, and other partners, including Europe, should be approaching China at this moment.
What we know about policymaking in China is that now there's a big debate over what to do about their relations with Russia. There's a big divide, two camps, and one side says that we should ditch our relations with Putin. Putin is doing terrible things, and we thought it was a big asset to have a good relationship with Russia. On the 4th of February, when Putin flew over to Beijing, and they issued this very lengthy joint statement, they were sure that this close relationship is a very big asset in fighting this competition with the United States. But 20 days later, there is this big danger that it's going to turn into liability. That's what one camp is arguing at the moment. I think Xi Jinping made a big mistake when he thought that the war was going to end very soon. Apparently, that's what he thought. But anyway, if the war continues in this way, I think increasingly China will lose credibility in the international society. Also, what's going to happen to Putin administration? We know these voices inside Russia now, very courageously raising their voices against this war. And with the sanctions, if the Putin administration is going to sink, and if Xi Jinping continues supporting Putin in this way, what's going to be the damage going to be inflicted on Xi Jinping, who is facing the party who is going to have the party congress, as Evan just told us. For Xi Jinping, what's most important is the stability, both inside China and in the international society. So this risk, I think, is very big for Xi Jinping. And that's the point that we should push. We should tell Xi Jinping, you have to do something to stop this, because otherwise you are going to lose. The cost is going to be so big. And I don't think you'd like to see that happen.
Mathieu, what role do you think that Europe is going to play? There are people who are really advocating that the EU should be putting pressure on China, urging it to get Russia to agree to a ceasefire. There's one question about whether Europe hopes to use the leverage of being an important trading partner for China. Is there a unique role that Europe can play?
I think that Europe's leverage vis-à-vis China is extremely limited. We have to keep in mind that, besides the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the EU-China relationship was previously in a state of stalemate. There's no positive agenda currently. The things that China wanted from Europe, such as the ratification of the comprehensive agreement on investment, is not going to happen. China is unhappy with a number of trends in Europe's foreign policy, including the turn to the Indo-Pacific. But at the same time, the trade and investment relationship continues growing. But what is clear to me is that this trade and investment relationship is not something that can be turned into political leverage to achieve anything. I think China has demonstrated in its foreign relations a very high degree of inflexibility when it comes to that. But Europe remains the main external market for Chinese exports, which is an interest that China will want to preserve. I don't think that at the current stage there is any threat that this market could shrink for Chinese exports. The other trend that is negative from a Chinese perspective is the construction of a toolbox of defensive measures on investment, on trade defense, on technology transfers. And this is the only thing that is actually moving in EU-China relations. The fact that Europe is unilaterally building those tools to rebalance the trade and investment relationship with China. So I'm giving this kind of overall picture of the relationship to insist on the fact that it will be extremely difficult for both sides to couple different issues, to couple the question of the war in Ukraine with other issues of the relationship. I don't see any possible trade-off between the EU and China at this stage. And one last thing I want to point out, I fully agree with Ivan that active military assistance from China to Russia would have a major impact on a lot of things, including on the EU-China relationship. That would completely undermine the remaining political trust that has already been affected by developments in recent years.
Evan?
So I have a slightly different take on how China thinks about Europe, Mathieu. I think Europe faces a moment of unique and really maximum strategic value to China right now. And I hope that European leaders recognize the moment and leverage the moment, right? The war is grinding on, and it's not good for China. China has aligned itself with Russia. But most importantly, Beijing has basically concluded that the US-China relationship has transitioned to a long-term rivalry. So, China has itself basically shackled to Russia. They know that they're competing with the US for the long term. And I think they look at Europe, and Europe is sort of the swing vote. And if Europe aligns with the United States against China, combined with allies and partners in East Asia, that configuration globally is, I think, a long-term challenge for the Chinese. And so I think the message, I would hope that the message from European leaders to China is basically, you can't afford to lose Europe right now, because that is to your long-term detriment, both economically, as you very nicely pointed out, but I think strategically as well. And I think we can all agree that, China in the last several decades has really sort of undervalued Europe, largely seeing it as a big market and relying on Chinese divide and conquer strategies. And I think now that we're having this, geopolitical moment within Europe, a revolution in German foreign policy, my hope is that that extends to Europe's relations with China. And I think the April 1 EU-China summit is a perfect moment to articulate that view. Because again, Europe has unique leverage with China right now, because I don't think China can afford to use Europe. And I think that the Chinese, understand that trends are not in their favor because of the choices they've made with Russia. And I completely agree with Akio's characterization. There's a debate in China, but the reality is Russia policy is set at the very top. I think Xi Jinping is a big driver of this. He's got a strong relationship with Putin. And, the Chinese probably know, but it's worth reminding them that Putin may not be around forever. So what happens if Putin just vanishes from the scene at some point for whatever reason? Suddenly the Chinese, if Europe is aligned against them, face a very, very challenging geopolitical situation. So Europe has a moment of maximum strategic value. I hope it takes it. Over to you, Bonnie. Thank you.
All right, before we close, I'm going to ask Akio one last question, which I think follows from Evan's points about, is there a moment where Putin becomes a liability for Xi Jinping, and what might trigger that? What would happen if the Russians decided, for example, to use chemical, biological, or God forbid, tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine? Is that what it takes, or what it might take for Xi Jinping to recalibrate? Or is it possible that an outreach from Europe might be enough to sort of pull Xi Jinping a bit away from Putin? Surely Xi Jinping must recognize that there are some downsides, but yet at this moment, I think he doesn't think that his alignment with Russia is a liability. So is that possible? What would it take?
Well, I would say the degree of, how do you say thing in English? I'm not sure, but the degree of liability is increasing, notching up every day. and therefore, certainly if he resorts to the use of chemical weapons or even nuclear weapons, that's going to, make it leap up. But he should realize that the degree of liability is rising day by day. And that's the message. I don't know whether people around him are telling him the truth, telling Xi Jinping the truth about the international situation. That's a big concern that we always have, but in this particular case, maybe it's a real issue, but hopefully he will realize the real situation through the conversations with international leaders such as President Biden.
Well, I want to thank you all for an outstanding conversation and all of your perspectives. We will all be watching this issue closely as President Biden prepares and then has that phone call tomorrow with Xi Jinping. And of course, looking forward to the April 1st EU summit, which Evan referred to, I think will also be an important moment. There is a role for many countries around the world to play, publicly, privately, and the positions that they take to urge Xi Jinping that he is on the wrong path. And as Secretary of State Blinken said yesterday, on the wrong side of history, which I very much agree with. So I want to thank all of you, Akio Takahara, Evan Medeiros, Mathieu Duchâtel for joining us for this terrific conversation today. And on behalf of the German Marshall Fund, thank you. Hope you'll join us again in the future. Thanks for watching.